Texas stretches out beneath an endless sky, a land where legends were born and empires rose from dust. Tonight, we'll uncover how a vast wilderness became the second largest state in America. Home to nearly 30 million people, Texas has weathered conquests, revolutions, oil booms, and devastating storms to emerge as one of the most influential regions in the world. We'll begin with ancient footprints in the red dirt of the Panhandle, and from there, we'll trace the relentless march of civilizations across the centuries. So just relax and let your mind drift as we explore the epic history of the Lone Star State. When you think of Texas, perhaps you picture sprawling ranches dotted with cattle, towering oil derricks against the horizon, or the gleaming skylines of Houston and Dallas. This state feels like the very embodiment of American ambition and independence. And indeed, Texas has long been a place where distances are measured not in miles, but in hours of driving, where everything truly is bigger. With the Alamo standing as a monument to sacrifice, and the state capital rising taller than the nation's own dome, there's an unmistakable sense of pride woven into every corner of this land. You can sense that this place has witnessed extraordinary transformations over the millennia. The modern cities and highways that crisscross Texas today represent just the latest chapter in a story that spans thousands of years. The sleek architecture of Austin and the bustling ports of the Gulf Coast were built upon layers of history that stretch back to when massive beasts roamed these plains. But the true drama of Texas begins not with its human inhabitants, but with the incredible creatures that once called this land home. During the Pleistocene epoch, roughly 2.6 million to 11,700 years ago, Texas was a vastly different world. Giant ground sloths the size of modern elephants lumbered through forests that covered much of what is now desert. Saber-toothed cats prowled alongside dire wolves, hunting massive bison with horns spanning 6 feet. Mammoths and mastodons trumpeted across grasslands that stretched to every horizon. It's almost impossible to imagine that here, where modern highways carry millions of commuters, colossal beasts once engaged in life and death struggles for survival. The climate was cooler and wetter then, supporting lush vegetation that could sustain these enormous creatures. Texas served as a corridor between the eastern woodlands and the western plains, creating a unique ecosystem where species from different regions mingled and evolved. The fossil record tells us that this ancient Texas was one of the richest and most diverse environments in North America. However, around 11,000 years ago, these magnificent creatures began to vanish, likely due to a combination of climate change and the arrival of a new predator that would reshape the land forever. The first humans to set foot in Texas arrived during the final stages of the last ice age, perhaps as early as 15,000 years ago. These Paleo-Indians were skilled hunters who had followed herds of mammoth and bison across the Bering land bridge from Asia. They carried finely crafted spear points and possessed an intimate knowledge of the landscape that allowed them to thrive in this challenging environment. Evidence of their presence has been found throughout Texas, from the Panhandle to the Rio Grande Valley. These early Texans lived in small nomadic bands that followed the seasonal migrations of game animals. They developed sophisticated hunting techniques, including the use of natural features like cliffs and arroyos to trap massive prey. At sites like the Galt archaeological site near Austin, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of stone tools and weapon points that reveal the remarkable skill of these ancient craftspeople. Their campsites tell stories of communities that gathered to share resources, trade materials, and pass down knowledge from one generation to the next. As the Ice Age ended and the great megafauna disappeared, the people of Texas adapted with remarkable resilience. They learned to hunt smaller game, gather wild plants, and develop new technologies suited to the changing environment. The Archaic period, which lasted from about 8,000 to 1,000 years ago, saw these communities become increasingly sophisticated in their use of the land's resources. During this time, different regions of Texas developed distinct cultural traditions. In East Texas, where rainfall was more abundant, people began experimenting with early forms of agriculture. They learned to cultivate wild plants and eventually adopted corn, beans, and squash from Mexico. In the arid regions of West Texas, communities became masters of desert survival, learning to find water in the most unlikely places and harvest the bounty of plants like the agave and prickly pear cactus. The archaic peoples of Texas were far from primitive. They created elaborate rock art that still adorns cave walls and cliff faces throughout the state. In the Pecos River region, ancient artists painted stunning murals that depict their spiritual beliefs, hunting practices, and daily life. These paintings, some of which are over 4,000 years old, represent one of the oldest continuous artistic traditions in North America. By 1,000 years ago, Texas had become home to numerous distinct Native American cultures, each perfectly adapted to their particular corner of this vast land. In the eastern forests, the Caddo people built permanent villages and developed complex agricultural systems. They were skilled potters and traders whose influence extended far beyond Texas borders. Their sophisticated society included hereditary chiefs, elaborate burial customs, and extensive trade networks that connected them with peoples as far away as the Great Lakes and the Pacific coast. The Caddo were master farmers who transformed the landscape through controlled burning and selective cultivation. They grew corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers in carefully tended fields, supplementing their diet with deer, fish, and wild plants. Their villages were centers of learning and ceremony, where knowledge was preserved and passed down through generations. The Caddo's influence was so significant that early European explorers named the entire region after them, calling it Teyas, which meant friends or allies in the Caddo language. In central Texas, a different way of life emerged among the peoples who would later be known as the Tonkawa. These were skilled hunters and gatherers who developed an intimate knowledge of the hill country's resources. They moved seasonally between campsites, following the rhythms of nature and the availability of food. The Tonkawa were renowned for their ability to find water in the limestone country, knowledge that would prove invaluable to later settlers. Along the Gulf Coast, yet another distinct culture flourished among the peoples known as the Karankawa. These were tall, powerful people who lived in harmony with the coastal environment. They were expert fishermen and canoe builders who harvested the abundant resources of the bays and estuaries. The Karankawa developed unique technologies for life by the water, including sophisticated fishing techniques and methods for processing seafood. But perhaps no group would have a more lasting impact on Texas history than the various Apache bands who dominated much of West and Central Texas. The Apache were relative newcomers to the region, having migrated south from the Great Plains sometime around 1500. They brought with them a warrior culture and a mobility that would define much of Texas history for the next 400 years. The Apache were masterful horsemen, though horses didn't arrive in Texas until the Spanish brought them in the 1500s. Before horses, Apache warriors were already formidable fighters who could cover vast distances on foot and strike their enemies with lightning speed. They lived in portable dwellings that could be quickly assembled and disassembled as they followed buffalo herds and raided their neighbors. These diverse Native American cultures had been shaping Texas for thousands of years when the first Europeans appeared on the horizon. Each group had developed unique solutions to the challenges of life in Texas, from the Caddo's agricultural innovations to the Apache's mobile warfare tactics. They had created trade networks that spanned the continent, artistic traditions that captured the beauty of their world, and spiritual beliefs that connected them deeply to the land. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic cultural collisions when Spanish explorers first glimpsed the Texas coast in the early 1500s. These Native American societies, refined over millennia, were about to encounter a force that would forever change their world. The Spanish came not as traders or peaceful visitors, but as conquistadors, driven by dreams of gold and glory. They brought with them diseases, weapons, and a worldview that would challenge everything the Native Americans had built. Yet the story of Texas was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The collision between Native American and European cultures would create a new chapter filled with conflict, adaptation, and transformation. From this meeting of worlds would emerge the complex multicultural society that would eventually become the Republic of Texas and then the Lone Star State. The Spanish explorers who first set foot on Texas soil could never have imagined the vast land that stretched before them. They were searching for cities of gold and passages to the Pacific, but instead they found something far more valuable, a land of infinite possibility where new societies could take root and flourish. The year 1519 marked a turning point that would echo through the centuries. A Spanish expedition led by Alonso Álvarez de Pineda became the first Europeans to map the Texas coastline, sailing along the Gulf of Mexico from Florida to Veracruz. As they gazed upon these unfamiliar shores, they could hardly comprehend the magnitude of the land that lay beyond the beaches and coastal marshes. Texas stretched inland for hundreds of miles, a territory larger than most European kingdoms. Yet to these explorers it was simply another obstacle on their quest for Asian riches. Pineda's maps would prove remarkably accurate, but his descriptions of the land and its people were filtered through European expectations and misunderstandings. He wrote of fierce warriors who painted their bodies and lived in harmony with nature, of vast rivers that might lead to golden cities, and of a coastline that seemed to stretch forever. These early accounts sparked the imagination of conquistadors throughout the Spanish Empire, setting in motion a series of expeditions that would fundamentally alter the course of Texas history. The real drama began in 1528, when disaster struck the expedition of Pánfilo de Narváez. Originally intended to conquer and colonize Florida, the expedition had gone catastrophically wrong. Storms, disease, and hostile encounters had decimated the Spanish forces, leaving the survivors desperate to reach Mexico by any means possible. In a last-ditch effort to escape, they constructed makeshift rafts and set sail along the Gulf Coast, hoping to follow the shoreline to safety. Most of the rafts were lost in the treacherous waters, but one vessel carrying Álvar Núñez, Cabeza de Vaca, and 3 companions was washed ashore on what is now the Texas coast, probably near Galveston Island. These 4 men, reduced from proud conquistadors to shipwrecked castaways, would spend the next 8 years wandering across Texas and the American Southwest. Their journey would become one of the most extraordinary survival stories in the annals of exploration. Cabeza de Vaca and his companions found themselves completely at the mercy of the Native American tribes they encountered. Gone were the steel armor and superior weapons that had given Spanish conquistadors their advantage in Mexico and Peru. Here in Texas, they were simply 4 starving, lost foreigners who had to rely on Native American hospitality to survive. The experience would transform their understanding of the New World and its peoples. The Karankawa, who first encountered these bedraggled Europeans, were as curious about the strangers as the Spanish were fearful of their hosts. These coastal people had never seen men with pale skin and facial hair, had never encountered horses or steel weapons, yet they showed remarkable compassion, taking in the survivors and nursing them back to health. In return, the Spanish slowly learned to adapt to a completely foreign way of life. Cabeza de Vaca's account of his time among the Texas tribes provides our first detailed glimpse into Native American life from a European perspective. He described the Karankawa's seasonal migrations between the islands and the mainland. Their sophisticated knowledge of coastal resources and their complex social relationships. He witnessed their ceremonies, learned their languages, and gradually came to respect their deep understanding of the natural world. But survival required more than just observation. The 4 Spaniards had to contribute something valuable to their hosts, and they discovered an unexpected talent for healing. Whether through European medical knowledge, psychological effect, or simple luck, Cabeza de Vaca and his companions gained a reputation as powerful medicine men. Word of their abilities spread throughout the region, and they found themselves passed from tribe to tribe, always moving westward toward Mexico. Their journey across Texas took them through landscapes that no European had ever seen. They crossed the pine forests of East Texas, where the Caddo people lived in permanent villages surrounded by agricultural fields. They traversed the Blackland prairies of central Texas, home to numerous hunting bands who followed the buffalo herds. They struggled across the harsh desert regions of West Texas, where survival depended on intimate knowledge of water sources and edible plants. Each region presented new challenges and new peoples. The Spaniards encountered dozens of different tribes, each with their own languages, customs, and ways of life. Some were agricultural peoples who lived in permanent settlements, while others were nomadic hunters who moved constantly across vast territories. Some welcomed the strangers with curiosity and generosity, while others viewed them with suspicion and hostility. Throughout their odyssey, Cabeza de Vaca and his companions were forced to abandon their European identities and adapt to Native American ways. They learned to eat foods that would have disgusted them in their former lives, to endure hardships that would have killed lesser men, and to navigate complex social situations where their survival depended on understanding subtle cultural cues. The transformation was so complete that by the time they finally reached Spanish settlements in Mexico in 1536, they were barely recognizable as the conquistadors who had set out 8 years earlier. Their skin was darkened by years under the Texas sun, their bodies hardened by constant travel and sparse diet. They had become something new, men who existed between 2 worlds and understood both. Cabeza de Vaca's eventual account of his travels, published as La Relación, became one of the most influential documents in the history of North American exploration. His descriptions of the vast lands and diverse peoples of Texas captured the imagination of Spanish officials and sparked a new wave of expeditions. But more importantly, his account revealed the humanity and complexity of Native American societies in ways that challenged European stereotypes and assumptions. The impact of this single shipwreck would reverberate through Texas history for generations. Cabeza de Vaca's reports convinced Spanish authorities that Texas might harbor great riches, leading to larger and more ambitious expeditions. But his descriptions of the land's challenges and the strength of its native peoples also served as warnings that conquest would not be easy. In 1540, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado launched the most ambitious Spanish expedition yet attempted in the American Southwest. Driven by tales of golden cities and vast riches, Coronado assembled an army of over 1,000 men and marched north from Mexico into the heart of Texas. His expedition would spend 2 years searching for the legendary 7 cities of gold, exploring vast regions of the American Southwest and encountering dozens of Native American communities. Coronado's forces entered Texas from the west, crossing into the Panhandle region where they encountered the Querechos, nomadic peoples who followed the immense buffalo herds across the plains. The Spanish were amazed by the sheer number of these animals, describing herds so vast that they blackened the prairie from horizon to horizon. They marveled at the Native Americans' skill in hunting these powerful beasts and their ingenious use of every part of the animal for food, clothing, shelter, and tools. But the golden cities proved to be mirages, and the expedition found no treasures comparable to those discovered in Mexico and Peru. The vast grasslands and harsh landscapes of Texas offered no easy wealth, only the promise of hard work and gradual development. Frustrated and running short of supplies, Coronado eventually abandoned his quest and returned to Mexico, leaving Texas once again to its native inhabitants. The failure of Coronado's expedition marked the end of the first phase of Spanish interest in Texas. For the next century and a half, the region remained largely outside Spanish control, visited only occasionally by missionaries, traders, and small exploring parties. Texas had proven too vast, too challenging, and too well defended by its native peoples to be easily conquered or colonized. During this period of relative isolation, the Native American peoples of Texas continued to develop and adapt. The introduction of horses, which had escaped from Spanish settlements and spread northward through trade and raiding, revolutionized life on the plains. Tribes that had once hunted buffalo on foot now became mobile cavalry forces capable of ranging across hundreds of miles. The Apache were among the first to master horsemanship, transforming themselves from skilled foot warriors into the most feared mounted fighters in North America. Their raids extended deep into Mexico, striking Spanish settlements and returning to the safety of the Texas plains with captured livestock and goods. The Spanish found themselves dealing with a completely new kind of warfare, one that took advantage of Texas's vast distances and the Apache's intimate knowledge of the terrain. Meanwhile, other changes were reshaping the Native American world. European diseases, spread through trade networks, and occasional contact with Spanish expeditions, devastated many communities. Entire villages were wiped out by smallpox, measles, and other ailments for which Native Americans had no immunity. The demographic collapse that followed these epidemics altered the balance of power throughout the region and created opportunities for more aggressive tribes to expand their territories. The Comanche emerged from this chaos as the dominant force on the southern plains, transforming themselves from a small mountain tribe into the most powerful Native American nation in Texas. Originally from the Rocky Mountains, the Comanche had migrated southward in the late 1600s, drawn by the abundance of horses and buffalo on the Texas plains. What they accomplished over the next century and a half would reshape the entire region and challenge every European power that dared to enter their domain. The Comanche didn't simply adopt horses, they revolutionized mounted warfare. Their children learned to ride before they could properly walk, developing skills that amazed even experienced Spanish cavalrymen. A Comanche warrior could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while hanging from the side of a galloping horse, reload his weapons at full speed, and maneuver his mount with subtle shifts of weight and pressure. Their horses became extensions of themselves, creating a bond between rider and animal that gave them tremendous advantages in battle. But the Comanche were more than just skilled warriors. They built a complex society that spanned vast territories across Texas and the southern plains. Their bands moved seasonally across established routes, following the buffalo herds and maintaining intricate networks of trade and kinship. They developed sophisticated systems of governance that allowed autonomous bands to coordinate their activities across hundreds of miles of territory. The buffalo provided everything the Comanche needed to thrive on the plains. These massive animals supplied meat for food, hides for shelter and clothing, bones for tools and weapons, and sinew for bowstrings and thread. The Comanche became so efficient at buffalo hunting that they could process an entire herd in a matter of hours, preserving enough meat to sustain their communities through the harsh winter months. Their mastery of the plains made the Comanche virtually invincible in their homeland. Spanish expeditions that ventured into Comanche territory found themselves harassed by swift raiders who appeared out of nowhere, struck with devastating effect, and vanished back into the vastness of the prairie. The traditional European tactics of siege warfare and pitched battles proved useless against an enemy that refused to stand and fight on anyone's terms but their own. The rise of Comanche power coincided with a renewed Spanish interest in Texas, driven not by dreams of gold, but by geopolitical necessity. French explorers had begun pushing south from their colonies in Louisiana, threatening to encircle Spanish possessions in Mexico. The Spanish realized that Texas, despite its challenges, represented a crucial buffer zone that could prevent French expansion and protect the silver mines of northern Mexico. In 1690, Spanish authorities finally committed to establishing permanent settlements in East Texas. They sent missionaries to convert the Caddo peoples and soldiers to build presidios that could serve as bases for further expansion. The mission of San Francisco de los Tejas became the first European settlement in the Texas interior, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the region's history. These early Spanish settlements faced enormous challenges. The climate was harsh, supplies from Mexico arrived irregularly, and the Native American response was mixed at best. The Caddo had their own sophisticated religious beliefs and saw little reason to abandon traditions that had served them well for centuries. Many Spanish colonists found themselves isolated in a hostile environment, dependent on Native American goodwill for their very survival. The French threat materialized in 1685 when René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, established Fort Saint-Louis near Matagorda Bay. La Salle's expedition was intended to create a French foothold on the Gulf Coast that could serve as a base for attacks on Spanish shipping and settlements. The fort represented everything the Spanish had feared about French expansion into Texas. However, La Salle's colony proved to be a disaster from the beginning. Disease, internal conflicts, and hostile encounters with local Native Americans decimated the settlement. La Salle himself was murdered by his own men during a desperate attempt to reach French settlements in Louisiana. When Spanish forces finally located Fort St. Louis in 1689, they found only ruins and a few survivors who had been living among the Karankawa. The destruction of La Salle's colony removed the immediate French threat, but it also demonstrated the challenges facing any European power that attempted to colonize Texas. The land itself seemed to resist foreign occupation, demanding a level of adaptation and understanding that few Europeans were prepared to provide. Yet the Spanish pressed forward, driven by imperial ambitions and the need to secure their northern frontier. Throughout the early 1700s, Spanish missionaries and soldiers established a chain of missions and presidios across East Texas. These settlements were intended to serve multiple purposes, converting Native Americans to Christianity, establishing Spanish territorial claims, and creating a defensive network against future foreign incursions. The missions of San Antonio, founded in 1718, became the most successful of these early settlements, growing into a thriving community that would play a crucial role in Texas history. The founding of San Antonio marked a new phase in Spanish colonization efforts. Unlike the isolated missions of East Texas, San Antonio was conceived as a permanent civilian settlement that could support itself through agriculture and trade. Spanish colonists brought with them centuries of experience in frontier settlement, adapting Mediterranean and Mexican agricultural techniques to the unique conditions of South Texas. The location of San Antonio was carefully chosen for its strategic and practical advantages. The San Antonio River provided a reliable water source in an otherwise arid region, while the surrounding hills offered defensive positions and building materials. The site lay along established Native American trade routes, ensuring access to regional networks of commerce and communication. But perhaps most importantly, San Antonio was positioned at the crossroads between different Native American territories. The Spanish hoped to use their settlement as a base for diplomatic negotiations with various tribes, playing different groups against each other and gradually extending Spanish influence across the region. This strategy would prove partially successful, but it also entangled the Spanish in complex webs of Native American politics that they never fully understood. The mission system that the Spanish established in Texas was based on their experiences in California and northern Mexico. Missions were intended to be temporary institutions that would convert Native Americans to Christianity and Spanish culture, eventually transforming them into loyal subjects of the Spanish crown. In theory, the missions would gradually secularize as Native American communities became fully integrated into Spanish colonial society. In practice, the mission system in Texas faced unique challenges that limited its effectiveness. Many Native American groups, particularly the nomadic peoples of the plains, had no interest in settling down to agricultural life. The Comanche and Apache continued their traditional patterns of movement and warfare, viewing the Spanish settlements as sources of livestock and goods rather than centers of civilization. Even among more sedentary peoples like the Caddo, Spanish missionary efforts met with limited success. These communities had their own rich spiritual traditions and sophisticated social structures that they were reluctant to abandon. Many Native Americans adopted superficial aspects of Spanish culture while maintaining their traditional beliefs and practices in private. The Spanish colonial period in Texas was characterized by a constant struggle between imperial ambitions and frontier realities. Spanish officials in Mexico City drew up elaborate plans for colonization and development, but these plans often ignored the practical challenges of life on the Texas frontier. Distance, climate, hostile Native Americans, and the sheer scale of the territory all worked against Spanish efforts to establish effective control. Despite these challenges, Spanish influence gradually spread across Texas through a combination of military force, missionary activity, and cultural exchange. Spanish settlers introduced new crops, livestock, and technologies that transformed the regional economy. Cattle ranching, in particular, became a cornerstone of Texas development, establishing patterns of land use that would persist long after Spanish rule ended. The Spanish also introduced new forms of social organization that would have lasting impacts on Texas culture. The hacienda system created large estates worked by Native American and mestizo laborers, while Spanish legal traditions established property rights and governance structures that influenced later American settlement. Spanish architectural styles, religious practices, and cultural traditions took root in Texas soil, creating a distinctive regional identity that blended European, Native American, and Mexican influences. Yet for all their efforts, the Spanish never achieved complete control over Texas. Vast regions remained under effective Native American control, particularly the Comanche domains of the central and western plains. Spanish settlements clustered along rivers and trade routes, connected by dangerous trails that passed through territories where Spanish authority was little more than a legal fiction. The Comanche Empire, as historians now call it, represented the most successful Native American adaptation to European colonization in North America. By the mid-17th century, Comanche bands controlled territory stretching from the Arkansas River to the Rio Grande, dominating trade networks that connected the Spanish settlements of New Mexico with the French colonies of Louisiana. They extracted tribute from Spanish settlements, controlled access to buffalo herds, and maintained their independence through a combination of military prowess and diplomatic skill. This balance of power would persist throughout the Spanish colonial period, creating a unique situation where European settlers existed as clients and competitors rather than masters of the land. The story of Spanish Texas was not one of conquest and submission, but of negotiation, adaptation, and cultural exchange between peoples who were forced to coexist in a vast and challenging landscape. The delicate balance between Spanish colonizers and Native American powers began to shift dramatically in the late 1700s as new forces emerged on the Texas frontier. The American Revolution, fought far to the east, sent ripples across the continent that would eventually reshape the political landscape of Texas. Spanish officials watched nervously as British power waned and a new nation took shape along the Atlantic coast, uncertain what this might mean for their own tenuous hold on the northern frontier. The emergence of the United States as an independent nation created both opportunities and threats for Spanish Texas. American traders began appearing along the eastern borders, bringing manufactured goods that Native American communities eagerly sought. These traders operated outside official Spanish control, establishing relationships with tribes that had previously dealt exclusively with Spanish authorities. The introduction of American goods and ideas began to alter the careful balance that Spanish officials had worked decades to establish. Meanwhile, the French presence in Louisiana complicated matters further. Napoleon's acquisition of Louisiana from Spain in 1800 placed a powerful European nation directly on Texas's eastern border. French traders and settlers had different relationships with Native American peoples than the Spanish, often serving as partners in commerce, rather than attempting conversion or conquest. This created new dynamics that threatened to undermine Spanish influence throughout the region. The situation became even more complex when Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States in 1803. Suddenly, Americans were no longer distant neighbours, but immediate border dwellers, with unclear territorial boundaries and ambitious westward expansion plans. The Louisiana Purchase brought American citizens to within miles of Spanish settlements, creating a frontier where two very different colonial systems would inevitably clash. American settlers began trickling into the disputed territories between Louisiana and established Spanish settlements almost immediately. These pioneers brought with them different attitudes toward land ownership, different relationships with Native American peoples, and different expectations about territorial expansion. Unlike Spanish colonists, who often worked within existing Native American trade networks, American settlers typically sought to replace indigenous peoples entirely, claiming exclusive ownership of the land they occupied. The Spanish response to American encroachment was hampered by the vast distances involved and the limited resources available to frontier administrators. Spanish officials could do little more than file diplomatic protests, while American settlers established farms, built communities, and created facts on the ground that would be difficult to reverse. The weakness of Spanish control became increasingly apparent as American influence spread westward. Filibustering expeditions began launching from American territory into Texas, seeking to establish independent republics or extend American control through force of arms. These unauthorized military adventures created constant tension along the frontier and demonstrated the inability of Spanish forces to defend their claimed territories effectively. Each failed expedition was followed by another, as ambitious Americans saw opportunity in the vast, lightly defended lands of Texas. The most significant of these early filibustering attempts was led by Philip Nolan, an Irish-American horse trader who'd been operating in Texas since the 1790s. Nolan claimed to be conducting legitimate business, capturing wild horses for sale in Louisiana, but Spanish officials suspected him of mapping the territory for future American military operations. When Nolan returned to Texas in 1801 with a well-armed expedition, Spanish forces confronted him near present-day Waco, killing Nolan and capturing most of his men. The death of Philip Nolan became a cause célèbre in the United States, where newspapers portrayed him as a martyred pioneer killed by tyrannical Spanish authorities. The incident inflamed anti-Spanish sentiment and encouraged other adventurers to view Texas as a land ripe for liberation. Spanish officials found themselves caught between the need to defend their territory and the desire to avoid incidents that might provoke American military intervention. These tensions culminated in the Gutierrez Magellan expedition, an of 1812 the most serious threat to Spanish rule that Texas had yet faced. Bernardo Gutiérrez de Lara, a Mexican revolutionary seeking independence from Spain, allied with Augustus Maggi, a former American army officer, to launch an invasion of Texas from Louisiana. Their combined force attracted hundreds of American volunteers, Mexican revolutionaries, and disaffected Spanish colonists who saw an opportunity to overthrow Spanish authority. The expedition initially met with remarkable success, capturing Nacogdoches, Goliad, and even San Antonio. For several months, it appeared that Spanish rule in Texas might collapse entirely. The rebels proclaimed the independence of Texas and established a provisional government that promised land grants to American settlers and protection for existing Spanish colonists who supported the revolution. However, the coalition that had driven the Spanish from much of East Texas began to fracture as differences emerged between American filibusters seeking territorial expansion and Mexican revolutionaries fighting for independence from Spain. Gutiérrez and Maggi quarreled over the expedition's ultimate objectives, weakening their forces at a crucial moment. Spanish reinforcements arrived from Mexico, led by experienced officers who had been fighting revolutionary movements throughout the empire. The reconquest of Texas was swift and brutal. Spanish forces, supplemented by loyal Native American allies, systematically retook the rebel-held territories. The Battle of Medina in August 1813 saw the complete destruction of the Revolutionary Army, with over 1,000 rebels killed in one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on Texas soil. The survivors fled across the border into Louisiana, leaving Spanish authority temporarily restored, but the territory devastated by months of warfare. The aftermath of the Gutiérrez-Maggi expedition revealed the fundamental weakness of Spanish control in Texas. The territory had been lost and regained not through the strength of Spanish institutions, but through the internal divisions of their opponents and the temporary deployment of military resources that could not be maintained indefinitely. Spanish officials recognized that Texas remained vulnerable to future American encroachment, and that new strategies would be needed to secure the frontier. The solution that emerged was both innovative and desperate. Spanish authorities decided to encourage legal American immigration to Texas under carefully controlled conditions. By allowing selected American families to settle in Texas as Spanish subjects, officials hoped to create a buffer population that would be loyal to Spain while providing the manpower needed to defend the territory against unauthorized American expansion. This policy of controlled colonization represented a dramatic departure from previous Spanish colonial practices. Rather than relying exclusively on Spanish and Mexican settlers, authorities would now actively recruit foreigners who would be expected to assimilate into Spanish colonial society. The plan required careful selection of colonists, strict supervision of their activities, and gradual integration into Spanish legal and cultural systems. The first American to receive permission for organized colonization was Moses Austin, a Missouri businessman who had previously operated lead mines in Spanish Louisiana. Austin's proposal to bring 300 American families to Texas appealed to Spanish officials because it promised to populate the territory with industrious settlers while maintaining Spanish sovereignty. Austin agreed to ensure that his colonists would become Spanish citizens, convert to Catholicism, and abide by Spanish laws. Moses Austin's death in 1821, just as his colonization plans were being approved, passed the responsibility to his son Stephen. Stephen F. Austin would become the most important figure in Texas colonization, establishing the foundation for American settlement that would eventually transform the territory entirely. His careful navigation of Spanish and later Mexican bureaucracy allowed him to bring thousands of American families to Texas under legal arrangements that satisfied colonial authorities. The success of Austin's colony encouraged other American entrepreneurs to seek colonization contracts in Texas. Empresarios, as these contractors were known, competed for the right to bring settlers to different regions of the territory. Each empresario was required to recruit a specified number of families, ensure their compliance with Mexican law, and assist with their integration into colonial society. The timing of this colonization effort coincided with Mexican independence from Spain in 1821, creating new opportunities and challenges for American settlers in Texas. The new Mexican government inherited Spanish policies toward American immigration, but brought different priorities and perspectives to frontier administration. Mexican officials were generally more liberal than their Spanish predecessors, but also more nationalistic and suspicious of American territorial ambitions. Under Mexican rule, the pace of American immigration to Texas accelerated dramatically. Thousands of families from the American South were attracted by offers of cheap, fertile land and the opportunity to establish new communities on the frontier. These settlers brought with them southern agricultural practices, including the cultivation of cotton using enslaved African American labor, fundamentally altering the economic and social structure of Texas. The Mexican government's ambivalent attitude toward slavery created tensions from the beginning of large-scale American settlement. While Mexican law technically prohibited slavery, American colonists were allowed to bring their enslaved workers as indentured servants under various legal fictions. This compromise satisfied neither Mexican officials concerned about humanitarian principles nor American settlers who wanted clear legal protection for their property rights in enslaved people. Cultural differences between American settlers and Mexican authorities became increasingly apparent as the immigrant population grew. American colonists were predominantly Protestant in a officially Catholic nation, English-speaking in a Spanish-speaking country, and committed to American legal traditions in a society governed by Mexican civil law. These differences created constant friction that Mexican officials struggled to manage effectively. The success of American colonization also attracted unwanted attention from unauthorized immigrants who crossed into Texas without legal permission. These illegal settlers, known as wetbacks because they often crossed rivers to enter the territory, established farms and communities without going through proper administrative channels. Their presence complicated efforts to maintain control over immigration and created additional sources of tension with Mexican authorities. By the late 1820s, the American population in Texas had grown to over 20,000, vastly outnumbering the Mexican and Spanish-descended inhabitants. This demographic shift alarmed Mexican officials, who began to question whether their policy of encouraging American immigration had been wise. The sight of entire regions where Spanish was rarely heard and Mexican law was casually ignored suggested that Texas might be slipping beyond effective Mexican control. The Mexican government's response was to attempt to reassert authority through a series of increasingly restrictive policies. The Law of April 6, 1830, suspended American immigration to Texas, prohibited the importation of enslaved people, and established new military garrisons to enforce Mexican authority. These measures were intended to prevent further American encroachment while encouraging Mexican and European immigration to balance the population. The implementation of these restrictive policies created immediate resistance among American settlers who had expected continued expansion of their communities. Colonists argued that the new laws violated the terms under which they had been recruited to Texas and threatened their economic survival. The prohibition on importing enslaved workers was particularly controversial among cotton planters who depended on slave labor for their prosperity. Tensions escalated when Mexican authorities began enforcing customs duties that had previously been ignored and restricting trade with the United States. American settlers had grown accustomed to easy commerce across the Louisiana border and resented efforts to redirect their trade through Mexican ports. The economic disruption caused by these policies created widespread dissatisfaction that would soon manifest in political resistance. The situation was further complicated by political instability within Mexico itself. The young nation struggled with conflicts between centralist and federalist factions, military coups, and regional rebellions that prevented consistent policy implementation. Mexican officials in Texas often found themselves caught between conflicting orders from different authorities and lacking the resources needed to enforce unpopular policies effectively. Antonio López de Santa Anna's rise to power in Mexico brought these tensions to a head. Santa Anna's increasingly authoritarian policies and his decision to abolish Mexico's federal constitution alarmed not only American settlers in Texas, but also Mexican federalists who supported local autonomy. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine whether Texas would remain Mexican territory or chart its own independent course. The growing crisis in Texas reflected larger patterns of conflict throughout the Americas as newly independent nations struggled to define their boundaries and establish effective governance over vast territories. The collision between American expansion and Mexican sovereignty in Texas would soon explode into open warfare, forever altering the balance of power in North America and setting the stage for the dramatic events that would transform Texas into an independent republic. The gathering storm that would reshape Texas forever began with a series of seemingly minor incidents that revealed the growing chasm between American colonists and Mexican authority. In the coastal town of Anahuac, customs collector Juan Davis Bradburn's heavy-handed enforcement of trade regulations sparked the first serious confrontation between settlers and Mexican officials. Bradburn, a former American who had joined the Mexican army, seemed determined to prove his loyalty by rigidly applying laws that had long been ignored on the frontier. The arrest of prominent colonist William Barrett Travis in 1832 for allegedly inciting resistance transformed local grievances into a broader movement for political reform. Travis, a young lawyer from Alabama who had come to Texas seeking a fresh start after personal scandals, embodied the ambitions and frustrations of many American settlers. His imprisonment at Anahuac became a rallying point for colonists who saw Mexican authority as increasingly arbitrary and oppressive. Word of Travis's detention spread rapidly through the scattered settlements of Texas, carried by riders who covered hundreds of miles to coordinate resistance efforts. The colonists organized citizen militias and demanded Bradburn's removal, threatening armed intervention if their grievances were not addressed. This early display of coordinated resistance revealed an emerging Texan identity that transcended individual empresario colonies and regional differences. The resolution of the Anahuac crisis through negotiation and Bradburn's eventual transfer seemed to restore calm, but it also demonstrated the weakness of Mexican authority when confronted by determined colonial resistance. Mexican officials lacked the military resources to suppress widespread unrest and found themselves dependent on the goodwill of the very people they were attempting to govern. This dynamic would prove unsustainable as political tensions continued to escalate. The Convention of 1832 marked the first formal attempt by Texas colonists to articulate their political demands and present a united front to Mexican authorities. Delegates from throughout the territory gathered in San Felipe to draft petitions requesting greater autonomy, resumption of American immigration, and exemption from certain Mexican laws that conflicted with their cultural practices. The convention represented a significant evolution in colonial political organization, moving beyond local protests toward territorial-wide coordination. Stephen F. Austin emerged as the reluctant leader of this political movement, despite his preference for quiet diplomacy and accommodation with Mexican authorities. Austin understood better than most colonists the delicate nature of their position and the risks involved in pushing too hard for political concessions. His careful management of colonial relations with Mexico had been crucial to the success of American settlement, and he feared that aggressive political action might jeopardize everything he had worked to build. The demands presented by the Convention of 1832 reflected the fundamental tensions inherent in Mexico's colonization policy. American settlers wanted the benefits of Mexican citizenship without fully accepting Mexican political and cultural authority. They sought to maintain their distinctive identity while enjoying the protection and privileges of Mexican law. This compromise position satisfied neither Mexican nationalists, who wanted complete assimilation, nor American settlers, who preferred complete autonomy. The Mexican response to colonial petitions revealed the government's own internal contradictions regarding Texas policy. Liberal officials sympathized with many colonial grievances and supported reforms that would integrate American settlers more effectively into Mexican society. Conservative and nationalist factions viewed any concessions as dangerous precedents that would encourage further American encroachment and ultimately threaten Mexican sovereignty over the territory. President Santa Anna's consolidation of power in Mexico City brought these policy debates to an abrupt end. His decision to abolish the federal constitution and establish centralized control over all Mexican territories represented a fundamental challenge to the autonomy that Texas colonists had come to expect. The new centralist policies eliminated local governance structures and placed all authority in the hands of appointed officials answerable only to the national government. The impact of Santa Anna's centralist revolution extended far beyond Texas, provoking rebellions throughout Mexico as regional leaders resisted the loss of their traditional autonomy. States like Zacatecas and Coahuila rose in armed revolt against the new centralist system, providing Texas colonists with potential allies in their resistance to Mexican authority. The broader pattern of resistance to Santa Anna's policies suggested that Texas grievances were part of a larger constitutional crisis affecting the entire Mexican Federation. Stephen F. Austin's journey to Mexico City in 1833 to present Texas demands for statehood and political reform marked a crucial turning point in colonial relations with the Mexican government. Austin spent months in the capital navigating complex political negotiations, while Santa Anna consolidated his power and eliminated opposition voices. The extended nature of his mission reflected both the importance of the issues at stake and the growing instability of Mexican politics. Austin's arrest and imprisonment in Mexico City on charges of inciting rebellion shocked Texas colonists and eliminated their most effective advocate for peaceful resolution of political differences. Mexican authorities intercepted a letter in which Austin had suggested that Texas might be forced to organize its own state government if Mexico refused to grant political concessions. This private correspondence, written in frustration after months of fruitless negotiations, was interpreted as evidence of treasonous intent. The imprisonment of Stephen F. Austin transformed him from a cautious diplomat into a reluctant martyr for Texas independence. His treatment by Mexican authorities convinced many colonists that peaceful accommodation was impossible and that more aggressive measures would be necessary to protect their rights and interests. Austin's suffering in Mexican jails became a powerful symbol of Mexican tyranny that galvanized colonial resistance throughout Texas. During Austin's absence, leadership of the colonial resistance movement passed to more radical figures who were less committed to peaceful resolution and more willing to contemplate armed resistance. Men like Sam Houston, a former Tennessee governor who'd come to Texas after his political career collapsed, brought experience in military affairs and American politics that would prove crucial in the coming crisis. Houston's presence in Texas reflected the growing involvement of prominent Americans in colonial affairs. The arrival of increasing numbers of recent American immigrants, many of whom had no personal investment in maintaining good relations with Mexican authorities, further radicalized Texas politics. These newcomers brought with them fresh memories of American political traditions and little patience for the complex compromises that earlier colonists had accepted. Their influence pushed colonial politics in increasingly confrontational directions that made peaceful resolution more difficult. The issue of slavery became increasingly central to the growing conflict between Texas colonists and Mexican authorities. The Mexican government's gradual movement toward abolition, influenced by liberal political philosophy and pressure from British abolitionists, directly threatened the economic foundation of American settlement in Texas. Cotton production using enslaved labor had become the cornerstone of colonial prosperity, and any interference with this system was seen as an existential threat. Mexican officials found themselves caught between their moral opposition to slavery and their practical need to maintain colonial loyalty and economic development. Attempts to enforce anti-slavery laws were met with fierce resistance from colonists who argued that such measures violated the terms under which they had been recruited to Texas. The slavery issue thus became a focal point for broader conflicts over cultural autonomy and political authority. The growing militarization of the Texas frontier reflected the breakdown of civil authority and the emergence of armed resistance as the primary means of resolving political disputes. Local militias that had originally been organized for protection against Native American raids began training for potential conflicts with Mexican forces. The transformation of defensive organizations into offensive military units marked a crucial step toward open rebellion. The Consultation of 1835 represented the final attempt at political resolution before the outbreak of armed conflict. Delegates from throughout Texas gathered to debate whether to seek reconciliation with Mexico under the restored federal constitution or to declare complete independence. The moderate faction, led by Stephen F. Austin following his release from Mexican prison, argued for continued efforts at political accommodation. Radical delegates pushed for immediate independence and military action against Mexican authority. The compromise position, adopted by the consultation, reflected the deep divisions within colonial society regarding the appropriate response to Mexican policies. The delegates declared their support for the Mexican Constitution of 1824 while establishing a provisional government with the authority to raise armies and conduct military operations. This position attempted to maintain legal justification for resistance while preparing for armed conflict. The military preparations undertaken following the consultation revealed the colonists' determination to resist Mexican authority through force if necessary. Volunteer companies formed throughout the territory, drilling with whatever weapons they could obtain and preparing defensive positions at strategic locations. The enthusiasm for military service demonstrated the extent to which political grievances had transformed into a willingness to risk everything for independence. The first shots of the Texas Revolution were fired at the Battle of Gonzales in October 1835, when Mexican forces attempted to reclaim a small cannon that had been provided to the town for defense against Native American raids. The colonists' refusal to surrender the weapon and their successful resistance to Mexican efforts to retrieve it transformed a minor dispute over military equipment into the opening engagement of a war for independence. The "Come and Take It" flag that flew over Gonzales during the battle became an enduring symbol of Texas defiance and independence. The colonists' willingness to fight over a single small cannon demonstrated their determination to resist any assertion of Mexican authority over their affairs. The successful defense of Gonzales encouraged other communities to organize resistance and provided the spark that ignited widespread rebellion throughout Texas. The rapid spread of revolutionary activity following Gonzales revealed the extent of colonial preparation for armed resistance. Within days of the first battle, volunteer companies were marching from throughout Texas to join the growing Revolutionary Army. The enthusiastic response to calls for military service demonstrated that the political grievances of previous years had created a broad base of support for armed resistance to Mexican rule. The Siege of San Antonio became the first major military operation of the Texas Revolution, as colonial forces surrounded the Mexican garrison and demanded its surrender. The prolonged nature of the siege allowed both sides to prepare for the larger conflict that was clearly approaching. Mexican authorities recognized that the loss of San Antonio would effectively end their control over Texas, while colonial leaders understood that success would provide them with crucial military resources and symbolic victory. The eventual capture of San Antonio by Texas forces marked a stunning early success for the revolutionary cause. The surrender of General Martin Perfecto de Cos and his garrison provided the Texas Army with badly needed artillery, ammunition, and military supplies. More importantly, the victory demonstrated that Mexican forces could be defeated in conventional warfare, encouraging additional volunteers to join the revolutionary cause. The success of early military operations created dangerous overconfidence among Texas leaders who underestimated the determination and resources that Santa Anna would bring to the reconquest of the territory. The easy victories at Gonzales and San Antonio suggested that Mexican resistance would collapse quickly, leading to strategic decisions that would prove disastrously wrong when Santa Anna arrived with a large, well-equipped army determined to crush the rebellion permanently. The Declaration of Independence, adopted by the Convention of 1836 at Washington on the Brazos, formally severed all ties between Texas and Mexico, establishing the Republic of Texas as an independent nation. The document, largely written by George Childress, enumerated the grievances that had led to revolution while proclaiming the right of the people of Texas to establish their own government. The Declaration represented the culmination of years of growing tensions and the formal beginning of Texas as a sovereign state. The timing of the Independence Declaration, occurring while Santa Anna's army was already advancing into Texas, reflected both the urgency of the military situation and the confidence of revolutionary leaders in their ultimate success. The delegates at Washington on the Brazos worked quickly to establish a constitutional framework for the new republic, while reports arrived of Mexican forces crossing the Rio Grande in overwhelming numbers. The Constitution of the Republic of Texas, adopted alongside the Declaration of Independence, established a democratic government based on American political principles while explicitly protecting the institution of slavery. The document reflected the values and priorities of American colonists who had shaped the revolutionary movement, creating a political system that would facilitate eventual annexation to the United States while maintaining the economic foundations of colonial society. The military crisis that coincided with these political developments tested the resolve and organizational capacity of the newly declared republic. Santa Anna's invasion force represented the largest military operation ever undertaken by Mexico, designed to crush the Texas Rebellion so thoroughly that no future resistance would be possible. The contrast between the professional Mexican army and the volunteer forces defending Texas seemed to favor the established government overwhelmingly. The Siege of the Alamo became the defining moment of the Texas Revolution, transforming a strategic military position into a symbol of heroic resistance against overwhelming odds. The decision by William Barrett Travis to defend the mission complex with fewer than 200 men against Santa Anna's army of thousands reflected both the desperate military situation facing Texas forces and the determination of revolutionary leaders to inspire continued resistance through their sacrifice. The 13-day siege captured the attention of the entire North American continent as reports of the defenders' situation spread through newspapers and personal correspondence. The presence of famous figures like James Bowie and Davy Crockett among the defenders elevated the siege from a local military engagement to an event of international significance. The story of brave men facing certain death for the cause of liberty resonated with American audiences and attracted sympathy for the Texas cause. The fall of the Alamo on March 6, 1836, and the execution of all defenders by Santa Anna's orders created martyrs whose deaths would inspire the Texas Army to ultimate victory. The brutality of the Mexican assault and the refusal to grant quarter to surrendering defenders shocked even experienced soldiers and provided powerful propaganda for the revolutionary cause. "Remember the Alamo" became the battle cry that would drive Texas forces to their final triumph. The massacre at Goliad, where Colonel James Fannin and over 300 captured Texas soldiers were executed on Santa Anna's orders, reinforced the perception of Mexican brutality and eliminated any possibility of negotiated settlement. The systematic execution of prisoners violated accepted standards of warfare and convinced remaining Texas forces that they were fighting for their very survival. The dual tragedies of the Alamo and Goliad created an atmosphere of desperate determination that would prove crucial in the final stages of the revolution. Sam Houston's strategic retreat in the face of Santa Anna's advance demonstrated the military wisdom that would ultimately save the revolutionary cause. Despite intense pressure from his own officers and criticism from civilian leaders, Houston refused to risk his army in premature battles against superior forces. His patient withdrawal eastward drew Santa Anna deeper into Texas while allowing time for reinforcements to arrive and for advantageous battle conditions to develop. The Battle of San Jacinto on April 21, 1836, lasted only 18 minutes, but determined the fate of Texas for generations to come. Houston's surprise attack on Santa Anna's overconfident army achieved complete tactical surprise, routing Mexican forces and capturing the dictator himself. The overwhelming nature of the Texas victory, with over 600 Mexican casualties against minimal Texas losses, demonstrated the power of motivated troops fighting for their homeland against an overextended invasion force. The capture of Santa Anna provided Texas with the leverage needed to secure recognition of independence and establish favorable territorial boundaries. The defeated dictator's willingness to sign treaties acknowledging Texas independence in exchange for his personal safety gave the new republic crucial legal standing in international law. Though Mexico would later repudiate these agreements, the treaties of Velasco provided the foundation for Texas' claims to legitimacy and territorial integrity. The establishment of the Republic of Texas as an independent nation created a unique political entity that would persist for nearly a decade before joining the United States. The new republic faced enormous challenges in establishing effective governance, defending its borders, managing its finances, and gaining international recognition. Yet the success of the revolution had created a Texan identity that would endure long after political independence ended, shaping the state's culture and character for generations to come. The euphoria of victory at San Jacinto could not mask the enormous challenges facing the newborn Republic of Texas. Sam Houston, elected as the first president of this unlikely nation, inherited a territory larger than France, but with a government that existed more on paper than in practice. The Republic's treasury was empty, its borders were disputed, and its very existence was denied by Mexico, which refused to recognize the treaties of Velasco as legitimate. Yet from these unpromising beginnings would emerge a remarkable experiment in frontier democracy that would capture the imagination of the world. The physical reality of governing Texas presented obstacles that would have daunted even experienced administrators. The republic stretched from the Sabine River to the Rio Grande, encompassing over 250,000 square miles of diverse terrain, inhabited by perhaps 50,000 people scattered across vast distances. Communication between settlements required weeks of dangerous travel through territories still controlled by hostile Native American tribes. The new government had to establish authority over this enormous expanse with virtually no resources and limited administrative experience. Houston's inauguration as president took place in the temporary capital of Columbia, a small town on the Brazos River that had been hastily selected when more established communities proved unsuitable. The ceremony itself reflected the improvised nature of the new republic, conducted in a simple wooden building with minimal pomp or circumstance. Yet the significance of the moment was not lost on those present, who understood they were witnessing the birth of a nation that had emerged from the dreams and sacrifices of thousands of ordinary people. The question of the republic's permanent capital became one of the first major political controversies, revealing deep divisions within Texas society about the future direction of the new nation. Houston favored a location that would be easily defensible and accessible to existing settlements, while other leaders pushed for a more ambitious site that would symbolize Texas's westward aspirations. The debate reflected larger tensions between practical necessity and visionary ambition that would characterize Texas politics throughout the Republican period. The selection of a site on the Colorado River for the new capital represented a bold statement of confidence in Texas's future. Named Austin in honor of Stephen F. Austin, who had died shortly after independence, the new capital was situated on the very edge of the frontier, surrounded by unsettled territory claimed by hostile Comanche bands. The decision to place the seat of government in such an exposed position demonstrated the optimism and determination that characterized the early republic. Construction of the new capital proceeded slowly, hampered by limited funds and the constant threat of Native American raids. Government officials often found themselves working in temporary buildings while construction crews labored to complete permanent structures. The contrast between the grand ambitions embodied in the capital's design and the crude reality of frontier life became a recurring theme in the early history of the Republic. The challenge of establishing diplomatic relations with foreign powers proved equally daunting. Texas desperately needed international recognition to legitimize its independence and secure the loans necessary for survival. However, most European nations were reluctant to recognize a slave-holding republic that had emerged from a rebellion against an established government. The diplomatic isolation of Texas forced its leaders to rely heavily on support from the United States while seeking creative approaches to international relations. The French government of Louis Philippe became the first European power to extend formal recognition to Texas, motivated by a desire to counterbalance growing American influence in North America. The French saw an independent Texas as a potential barrier to American expansion and a source of cotton for their textile industry. This recognition provided Texas with crucial international legitimacy and opened the door for commercial relationships that would help sustain the struggling republic. British interest in Texas developed more slowly, but eventually became even more significant than French support. The British government saw Texas as an opportunity to maintain access to cotton supplies, while potentially limiting American territorial expansion. British abolitionists also hoped that an independent Texas might eventually abolish slavery, creating a free republic on the borders of the slave-holding American South. These conflicting motivations would create complex diplomatic relationships that shaped Texas' foreign policy throughout the Republican period. The question of annexation to the United States dominated Texas politics from the moment of independence. Many Texans had fought for independence with the assumption that their new republic would quickly join the United States, fulfilling what they saw as their natural destiny. However, American reluctance to accept a new slave state that would upset the delicate sectional balance in Congress meant that annexation would prove far more complicated than anticipated. President Andrew Jackson's cautious approach to Texas annexation reflected both constitutional concerns and political calculations. While personally sympathetic to Texas independence, Jackson recognized that immediate annexation might provoke war with Mexico and would certainly inflame sectional tensions over slavery. His decision to extend recognition to Texas while avoiding commitments regarding annexation established a pattern of American policy that would persist for nearly a decade. The economic foundation of the Republic of Texas rested primarily on cotton cultivation and cattle ranching, both of which depended on the availability of enslaved labor and vast tracts of land. The Republic's constitution explicitly protected slavery and prohibited the legislature from interfering with the institution, reflecting the priorities of the American settlers who had led the independence movement. This commitment to slavery would prove both an economic asset and a diplomatic liability throughout the Republican period. The land policy of the Republic of Texas represented one of its most successful and influential innovations. The new government inherited Mexican land grants while creating new systems for distributing public lands to encourage immigration and reward military service. Veterans of the Revolution received land bounties based on their length of service, while new immigrants could purchase land at nominal prices. This generous land policy attracted thousands of new settlers and established patterns of land ownership that would persist long after Texas joined the United States. The Republic's military challenges proved as daunting as its political and economic problems. Mexican forces continued to launch raids across the Rio Grande, treating Texas as a rebellious province that would eventually be reconquered. The most serious of these incursions occurred in 1842, when Mexican armies briefly occupied San Antonio and Goliad, demonstrating the continuing vulnerability of Texas to external attack. The Republic's small regular army was supplemented by volunteer militia units that provided local defense but lacked the training and equipment necessary for sustained campaigns. The Comanche Empire remained the most serious military threat facing the Republic of Texas. The powerful confederation of Comanche bands controlled vast territories in central and western Texas, raiding settlements and blocking westward expansion. The Republic's relationship with the Comanche alternated between uneasy truces and violent conflicts, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. The Council House Fight of 1840, where Comanche chiefs were killed during peace negotiations in San Antonio, led to a series of retaliatory raids that devastated the Texas frontier. The Cherokee War of 1839 demonstrated the Republic's determination to remove all Native American peoples from East Texas, regardless of their previous relationships with Texas authorities. Chief Bowl and his Cherokee followers had lived peacefully in East Texas for decades, but President Mirabeau Lamar's policy of Indian removal led to their forcible expulsion. The brutal efficiency with which Texas forces destroyed Cherokee settlements and drove survivors across the border into Arkansas established a pattern of ethnic cleansing that would characterize the Republic's Native American policy. Mirabeau Lamar's presidency marked a dramatic shift in Texas policy toward both Native Americans and Mexico. Unlike Sam Houston, who favored defensive strategies and diplomatic solutions, Lamar advocated aggressive expansion and the complete removal of all Native American peoples from Texas territory. His vision of a great Texas empire stretching to the Pacific Ocean led to ambitious but ultimately disastrous military expeditions that nearly bankrupted the Republic. The Santa Fe expedition of 1841 represented the most ambitious and catastrophic attempt by the Republic of Texas to extend its authority beyond the settled regions. Lamar's decision to send a military and commercial expedition to claim the upper Rio Grande Valley reflected his grandiose vision of Texas expansion. But the expedition's capture by Mexican forces and the subsequent imprisonment of its members in Mexico created a diplomatic crisis that strained relations with the United States and European powers. The failure of the Santa Fe expedition highlighted the gap between Texas ambitions and Texas capabilities during the Republican period. The Republic's leaders dreamed of continental empire, but lacked the population, resources, and military strength necessary to achieve such goals. The expedition's collapse forced a more realistic assessment of Texas' limitations and contributed to growing support for annexation to the United States as the only viable path to security and prosperity. Sam Houston's return to the presidency in 1841 marked a shift back toward more cautious policies focused on financial stability and diplomatic relations. Houston inherited a republic on the verge of bankruptcy, with a worthless currency and massive debts from Lamar's expansionist adventures. His administration concentrated on repairing relationships with Native American tribes, reducing government expenses, and rebuilding international confidence in Texas' financial stability. The complex relationship between Texas and the United States during the Republican period reflected broader American debates about slavery, territorial expansion, and sectional balance. Northern opponents of annexation feared that Texas would strengthen the political power of slaveholding states, while Southern supporters saw Texas as essential to maintaining sectional equality in Congress. These tensions would eventually contribute to the polarization that led to civil war, but during the 1840s, they primarily served to delay Texas annexation. The presidential election of 1844 in the United States transformed the annexation question from a diplomatic curiosity into a central political issue. James K. Polk's victory on a platform of territorial expansion, including the annexation of Texas, provided the political support necessary for congressional action. The Democratic Party's embrace of manifest destiny created momentum for annexation that overcame previous objections and constitutional concerns. The joint resolution annexing Texas, passed by Congress in early 1845, represented a creative solution to the constitutional problems that had previously blocked annexation. Rather than attempting to acquire Texas through a treaty that would require a two-thirds majority in the Senate, congressional leaders used a joint resolution that needed only simple majorities in both houses. This procedural innovation allowed annexation while avoiding the supermajority requirements that had previously made action impossible. The Texas Convention that accepted American annexation in 1845 marked the end of the Republic of Texas as an independent nation. The delegates who gathered in Austin to consider the American offer understood that they were making a momentous decision that would shape the future of their homeland for generations. The vote to accept annexation was overwhelming, reflecting both the practical benefits of joining the United States and the cultural affinity that most Texans felt for their northern neighbor. The transition from republic to statehood proceeded smoothly, despite concerns that Mexico might attempt military intervention to prevent annexation. The Mexican government had consistently maintained that Texas remained a rebellious province and that American annexation would constitute an act of war. However, Mexico's internal political instability and limited military resources prevented effective opposition to annexation, allowing the transition to proceed without the armed conflict that many had feared. The admission of Texas as the 28th state in December 1845 represented the culmination of a remarkable transformation that had occurred over just 9 years. The vast territory that had been claimed by Spain, governed by Mexico, and briefly independent as a republic, now became part of the expanding American nation. Yet the unique history of Texas had created a distinctive identity that would persist long after statehood, influencing the state's politics, culture, and self-image for generations to come. The Mexican-American War that began in 1846 vindicated many of the territorial claims that the Republic of Texas had been unable to enforce during its brief existence. American military victories established the Rio Grande as the definitive border between Texas and Mexico, while also acquiring vast territories in the southwest that fulfilled the continental ambitions of Manifest Destiny. The war demonstrated the power that Texas gained through association with the United States, while also validating the strategic vision of those who had advocated annexation. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 brought thousands of fortune seekers through Texas on their way to the Pacific coast. These 49ers followed established trails across the state, creating new economic opportunities for Texas merchants and transporters, while also bringing fresh perspectives and capital to previously isolated communities. The California Gold Rush marked the beginning of Texas's emergence as a crucial crossroads in the expanding American transportation network. The Compromise of 1850 resolved the boundary dispute between Texas and the federal territory of New Mexico, while providing the states with $10 million in federal bonds to pay off debts from the Republican period. This financial settlement eliminated the crushing debt burden that had threatened Texas throughout its independent existence, while also establishing the state's modern western boundary. The compromise demonstrated the benefits of statehood, while also revealing the complex sectional tensions that would eventually lead to civil war. The development of Texas during the 1850s reflected the state's integration into the national economy and transportation system. Railroad construction began connecting Texas cities to each other and to markets in the eastern United States, while steamboat traffic on Texas rivers provided crucial links between inland communities and coastal ports. These transportation improvements facilitated the expansion of cotton cultivation and cattle ranching, while also encouraging the development of new industries and commercial enterprises. The population growth of Texas accelerated dramatically after statehood, as immigrants from both the United States and Europe were attracted by opportunities in agriculture, ranching, and commerce. German immigrants established thriving communities in the hill country, bringing with them distinctive cultural traditions and agricultural techniques that enriched Texas society. The diversity of Texas immigration created a complex cultural landscape that reflected influences from across the American South, the German states, and Mexico. The institution of slavery expanded significantly during the antebellum period, as cotton cultivation spread across east and central Texas. The enslaved population of Texas grew from fewer than 60,000 in 1845 to over 180,000 by 1860, representing nearly one-third of the state's total population. This expansion of slavery created enormous wealth for Texas planters, while also deepening the state's commitment to the institution that would ultimately lead to secession and civil war. The political development of antebellum Texas reflected both the state's southern origins and its distinctive frontier experience. The Democratic Party dominated state politics, advocating for states' rights and the expansion of slavery, while also supporting internal improvements and economic development. Texas politicians like Sam Houston gained national prominence, but their moderation on sectional issues sometimes put them at odds with more radical elements within the state. The secession crisis that gripped the United States in 1860 to 1861 created agonizing choices for Texas political leaders who had to balance their loyalty to the Union against their commitment to Southern institutions and culture. Sam Houston's opposition to secession as governor of Texas reflected his understanding of the costs that disunion would impose, but his views were increasingly out of step with public opinion in a state that had become thoroughly Southern in its outlook and interests. The vote for secession by the Texas Convention in February 1861 marked another dramatic turning point in the state's history, as Texas once again chose independence over union with a larger political entity. The decision to join the Confederacy represented a rejection of the path that had brought prosperity and security through association with the United States, but it also reflected the deep cultural and economic ties that bound Texas to the slave-holding South, holding South. The transformation of Texas from an independent republic to a Confederate state marked yet another chapter in its extraordinary journey through different political identities. The Secession Convention that met in Austin during the winter of 1861 faced decisions that would plunge the states into the bloodiest conflict in American history. Delegates arrived from across Texas carrying the hopes and fears of communities that had prospered under American rule, but now felt their way of life threatened by Northern political dominance. The debate over secession revealed deep fissures within Texas society that had been masked by years of prosperity and growth. Eastern counties, where cotton plantations dominated the landscape and enslaved people comprised large portions of the population, overwhelmingly supported joining the Confederacy. These areas had the most to lose from any federal interference with slavery and saw secession as essential to protecting their economic interests and social system. Central Texas presented a more complex picture, with communities divided between Unionist sentiment and Confederate loyalty. The German settlers of the Hill Country, many of whom had fled European political oppression, viewed secession with deep suspicion and remained largely loyal to the federal government. Their opposition to slavery and commitment to Union principles created tensions that would persist throughout the war years. West Texas, still largely frontier territory, where Comanche bands maintained effective control over vast regions, seemed almost disconnected from the sectional crisis consuming the rest of the state. Ranchers and settlers in these areas were more concerned with immediate survival against Native American raids than with abstract questions of constitutional theory. Yet even here, the pull of Southern identity and the promise of Confederate protection against federal interference proved compelling to many residents. The removal of Sam Houston from the governor's office for refusing to take an oath of allegiance to the Confederacy symbolized the complete triumph of secessionist sentiment in Texas. Houston's warnings about the costs of civil war and his predictions of Confederate defeat proved prophetic, but his moderate voice was overwhelmed by the passion and optimism of those who believed the South could successfully establish its independence. The early months of Confederate Texas witnessed an explosion of patriotic enthusiasm as young men rushed to join military companies forming throughout the state. Towns competed to outfit the most elegant volunteer units, with wealthy planters financing elaborate uniforms and equipment for local companies. The romantic vision of a brief, glorious war dominated public discourse, while few contemplated the grinding reality of a prolonged conflict that would test every aspect of Texas society. The geography of Texas created unique challenges for Confederate military planners who had to defend an enormous territory with limited resources. The state's long coastline required fortification against federal naval attacks, while the western frontier demanded continued vigilance against Comanche and Apache raids. The Rio Grande border with Mexico opened possibilities for international trade that might circumvent the federal blockade, but it also created opportunities for enemy infiltration and espionage. The Battle of Galveston in 1863 demonstrated both the vulnerability and resilience of Confederate Texas when federal forces occupied the state's most important port. The successful Confederate recapture of the city became a source of immense pride throughout Texas and showed that determined resistance could overcome seemingly hopeless odds. However, the ease with which federal forces had initially seized Galveston revealed the fundamental weakness of Confederate coastal defenses. The federal blockade of Texas ports created immediate economic hardship as cotton exports, the foundation of the state's prosperity, became virtually impossible. Planters who had grown wealthy shipping cotton to European markets found their crops piling up in warehouses, while the Confederate currency they received for domestic sales rapidly lost value. The disruption of international trade forced Texas to develop new economic relationships and find alternative sources for manufactured goods. The transformation of the Texas economy during the war years revealed remarkable adaptability as communities learned to produce goods that had previously been imported from the North or Europe. Textile mills sprang up to process cotton locally, while blacksmiths and craftsmen adapted their skills to produce military equipment and supplies. Women took leading roles in these economic adjustments, organizing spinning circles and managing plantations, while their husbands served in Confederate armies. The conscription laws enacted by the Confederate government created significant tension within Texas as communities struggled to provide soldiers for distant armies while maintaining local defense against Native American raids. The exemption of overseers on large plantations sparked resentment among small farmers who felt they were bearing an unfair burden of military service. Draft resistance became common in areas where Unionist sentiment remained strong, particularly in the German counties of central Texas. The massacre at the Nueces River in August 1862 revealed the brutal reality of internal conflict within Texas as Confederate authorities pursued German Texans attempting to flee to Mexico rather than serve in rebel armies. The execution of dozens of men who had been trying to reach federal lines demonstrated the extent to which civil war had fractured Texas society along ethnic and political lines. The incident created lasting bitterness that would influence Texas politics for generations. Confederate efforts to maintain control over West Texas proved increasingly futile as the war diverted military resources to other theaters. Comanche and Kiowa raids intensified during the war years, taking advantage of reduced frontier defenses to strike deep into settled areas. Entire counties were virtually abandoned as families fled eastward, seeking safety in more populated regions where Confederate forces could provide some protection. The Red River Campaign of 1864 brought federal armies deep into East Texas, threatening the state's agricultural heartland and disrupting Confederate supply lines. Though ultimately unsuccessful, the federal advance demonstrated the vulnerability of Confederate Texas to invasion and forced the evacuation of the state government from Austin to Houston. The campaign's failure provided temporary relief, but it also revealed how thinly Confederate defenses were stretched across the enormous territory. The collapse of Confederate resistance in other theaters gradually isolated Texas from the rest of the rebellion, creating a unique situation where the state continued fighting long after the cause had become hopeless elsewhere. General Edmund Kirby Smith's Trans-Mississippi Command operated with increasing independence from Richmond, negotiating directly with French forces in Mexico and attempting to maintain Confederate authority through local resources and determination. News of Lee's surrender at Appomattox reached Texas slowly, carried by refugees and deserters who brought tales of Confederate collapse in Virginia. The reaction varied dramatically across different regions, with some communities accepting the inevitability of defeat, while others prepared for continued resistance. The uncertainty created a period of lawlessness as Confederate authority dissolved and federal occupation had not yet been established. The Battle of Palmito Ranch in May 1865 fought weeks after Lee's surrender, became known as the last land battle of the Civil War. This final Confederate victory, achieved by Texas troops against federal forces near Brownsville, provided a bittersweet end to the state's Confederate experience. The battle's outcome seemed to vindicate those who had argued for continued resistance, even as the broader war had already been lost. General Gordon Granger's arrival in Galveston on June 19, 1865, marked the effective end of Confederate Texas and the beginning of a new era of federal occupation. Granger's proclamation announcing the emancipation of all enslaved people in Texas created immediate chaos as nearly 200,000 African Americans learned of their freedom. The date would become known as Juneteenth, a celebration that spread throughout the African American community and eventually gained national recognition. The immediate aftermath of emancipation created enormous challenges as former enslavers and formerly enslaved people struggled to understand their new relationships. Many planters attempted to maintain control over their workers through labor contracts and physical intimidation, while freed people sought to reunite with family members, obtain education, and establish independent lives. The Federal Freedmen's Bureau attempted to mediate these conflicts, but its limited resources proved inadequate to the enormous task. The migration of freed people within Texas during the early years of Reconstruction created new demographic patterns as African Americans sought economic opportunities and safety in numbers. Houston, San Antonio, and other cities experienced rapid growth as rural freed people fled plantation areas where violence and intimidation remained common. These urban communities became centers of African American political organization and cultural development. Presidential Reconstruction under Andrew Johnson allowed former Confederates to regain control of Texas government relatively quickly, leading to the passage of black codes designed to limit the rights of freed people and maintain white supremacy. These laws restricted African American movement, required labor contracts that resembled slavery, and denied basic civil rights. The severity of these measures contributed to growing Northern support for more radical Reconstruction policies. The Constitutional Convention of 1866 revealed the extent to which white Texans remained committed to the principles that had led to secession and war. Delegates refused to repudiate Confederate debt, grant meaningful rights to freed people, or acknowledge the legitimacy of federal authority over state affairs. Their intransigence convinced congressional Republicans that more drastic measures would be necessary to reconstruct Southern society. Military Reconstruction, imposed by Congress in 1867, divided Texas into military districts under federal control and required new constitutional conventions with African American participation. The resulting government, dominated by Republicans and supported by freed people, Union veterans, and some white Texans, attempted to create a more democratic society. However, these efforts faced violent opposition from organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups. The Constitutional Convention of 1868 to 1869 marked the high point of Republican influence in Texas as delegates drafted a document that guaranteed civil rights, established public education, and created more democratic political institutions. African American delegates played crucial roles in these proceedings, bringing perspectives shaped by their experiences of slavery and their hopes for equality. The resulting constitution represented a dramatic departure from previous Texas government structures. Edmund J. Davis's governorship from 1870 to 1874 represented the most ambitious attempt to reconstruct Texas society along egalitarian lines. His administration established the first statewide public school system, created a state police force to combat violence against African Americans, and attempted to attract Northern investment to diversify the Texas economy. However, these reforms faced constant opposition from white Democrats, who viewed them as illegitimate impositions of federal power. The use of federal troops and state police to maintain order during Reconstruction created lasting resentment among white Texans who viewed these forces as occupying armies. Incidents like the Milliken riot and the killing of state policemen in various counties demonstrated the extent of resistance to Republican rule. The violence convinced many moderate whites that compromise with the Republican government was impossible. The gradual withdrawal of federal support for Reconstruction governments reflected growing Northern weariness with Southern resistance and changing political priorities in Washington. The economic depression of the 1870s shifted national attention away from civil rights issues toward economic concerns, weakening Republican commitment to protecting African American rights in the South. This abandonment left Texas Republicans increasingly isolated and vulnerable to Democratic resurgence. The election of 1873 marked the beginning of the end for Republican Reconstruction in Texas as economic hardship and continued violence eroded support for the Davis administration. Democratic candidates campaigned on promises to restore home rule and reduce government spending, appealing to white voters who blamed Republican policies for the state's problems. The narrow Republican victory in this election would prove to be the last for many decades. The disputed election of 1874 brought Richard Koch to the governor's office and effectively ended Reconstruction in Texas. Koch's Democratic administration immediately began dismantling Republican reforms, reducing funding for public education, dissolving the state police, and rolling back civil rights protections. The speed with which these changes occurred demonstrated the fragility of Reconstruction achievements in the face of determined opposition. The Constitution of 1876, drafted in reaction against Republican Reconstruction, severely limited state government power and enshrined democratic principles that would dominate Texas for the next century. The document reflected deep suspicion of centralized authority and strong government, creating a weak executive branch and limiting the state's ability to address social and economic problems. This constitutional framework would prove remarkably durable, surviving well into the modern era. The end of Reconstruction marked the beginning of a new era in Texas history, as the state embarked on a period of dramatic economic expansion and population growth. The arrival of railroads, the development of cattle ranching on an industrial scale, and the discovery of oil would transform Texas from a primarily agricultural society into a major economic power. Yet the racial tensions and political divisions created during Reconstruction would continue to shape Texas society for generations, influencing everything from labor relations to political culture in ways that are still visible today. The transformation of Texas in the decades following Reconstruction would prove as dramatic as any period in its tumultuous history. The state that emerged from the ashes of civil war and the chaos of political reconstruction bore little resemblance to the agrarian society that had joined the Confederacy just 15 years earlier. New technologies, new populations, and new economic opportunities were reshaping the landscape in ways that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations of Texans. The railroad revolution that swept across America in the 1870s and 1880s found particularly fertile ground in Texas, where vast distances had always posed challenges to commerce and communication. The first major rail line to cross the state, the Texas and Pacific, reached Dallas in 1873 and continued westward toward El Paso, connecting previously isolated communities to national markets for the first time. The Houston and Texas Central pushed northward from the Gulf Coast, while other lines began forming a network that would fundamentally alter the economic geography of the state. The impact of railroad construction extended far beyond simple transportation improvements. Towns that found themselves along rail routes experienced explosive growth, while those bypassed by the iron rails often withered into obscurity. Entire communities picked up and moved when they learned a railroad would pass nearby, creating boom towns that sprang up almost overnight wherever tracks were laid. The railroad companies themselves became some of the largest landowners in the state, receiving massive grants of public land in exchange for their construction efforts. Fort Worth exemplified the transformative power of railroad development, evolving from a frontier military outpost into a major commercial center within the span of a few years. The arrival of the Texas and Pacific Railroad in 1876 connected the city to markets in the east, while subsequent rail lines made it a hub for the emerging cattle industry. The city's stockyards became legendary throughout the Southwest, processing millions of cattle that arrived by trail from across Texas and the Great Plains. The cattle industry itself underwent revolutionary changes during this period, transforming from the small-scale ranching operations of the antebellum era into vast commercial enterprises that dominated much of West Texas. The end of the Civil War had left Texas with enormous herds of cattle but limited markets, creating opportunities for entrepreneurs who could solve the transportation problem. The great cattle drives of the 1870s and 1880s became the stuff of legend, with millions of longhorns making the journey northward to railroad terminals in Kansas and beyond. The Chisholm Trail, stretching from South Texas to Kansas, became the most famous of these cattle highways, carrying an estimated 5 million cattle northward during its peak years. The trail passed through the heart of Texas, creating temporary boom towns wherever drovers stopped to rest and resupply. Towns like Wichita Falls and Abilene owed their early growth to the cattle trade, developing economies centered around servicing the needs of cowboys and their herds. The romance of the cowboy era captured imaginations far beyond Texas, but the reality was often harsh and dangerous. Cowboys faced constant threats from weather, wild animals, hostile Native Americans, and cattle rustlers during drives that could last several months. The work was physically demanding and poorly paid, attracting young men who were drawn by adventure rather than economic opportunity. Many cowboys were African American or Mexican, though their contributions were often overlooked in later mythologizing of the period. The decline of the great cattle drives in the 1880s resulted from the same railroad expansion that had initially made them profitable. As rail lines extended into Texas itself, the need to drive cattle hundreds of miles to market diminished. Ranchers could now ship their livestock directly from local stations, reducing costs and eliminating the risks associated with long overland drives. The era of the trail drive was essentially over by 1890, though its memory would live on in American popular culture. The development of West Texas during this period required not just transportation improvements, but also solutions to the region's water scarcity and ongoing conflicts with Native American tribes. The US Army established a chain of forts across the frontier, providing protection for settlers and gradually pushing Comanche and Apache bands westward into New Mexico and Indian Territory. The Red River War of 1874 to 1875 marked the final defeat of Comanche resistance, opening vast areas of the Panhandle and West Texas to settlement and development. Windmills became iconic symbols of West Texas development, providing reliable water sources that made ranching and farming possible in previously uninhabitable areas. These mechanical marvels, often imported from the Midwest, could pump water from deep underground sources, creating oases of green in the midst of harsh semi-arid landscapes. The sight of windmills dotting the horizon became as characteristic of Texas as the longhorn cattle they supported. And so our journey through the vast chronicles of Texas draws to a close, though the story itself continues to unfold with each passing day. From the thunderous footsteps of ancient mammoths across Pleistocene grasslands to the gleaming towers of modern Houston, we've witnessed an extraordinary tapestry of human ambition, natural wonder, and relentless transformation. This land has seen empires rise and fall, witnessed the dreams of countless peoples seeking new beginnings, and endured through conquest, revolution, and rebirth to emerge as one of America's most influential states. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let your mind wander across these endless plains where legends were born, where the spirit of independence still echoes through the hill country, and where the promise of tomorrow stretches as wide as that famous Texas sky.